how to add and subtract mixed numbers. So to add or subtract mixed numbers, first you've got to add or subtract the fractions. So first, add or subtract the fractions. If necessary, rename using the least common denominator, and we know that we have to have least common denominators to add or subtract fractions. Okay? Then add or subtract the whole numbers and simplify if necessary. So I want you to make sure that you add or subtract the fractions first, because just like when you're doing your regular subtraction, remember you work from the right to the left, we need to do the same thing when we're adding our fractions, okay, or subtracting them. All right, so here we've got 5 1/5 plus 2 3/10. So we need to add the fractions first. We can't do that here because we need them to be like fractions. Remember, we have to have the least common denominator. So I've got 1/5 and 3/10. Well, I know that I can use 10 as my least common denominator. And if you need to list out the multiples, do that. But I know 5 times 2 will get me 10, and so I'm going to do the same thing to my numerator. So that means that I'm doing 5 2/10 plus 2 3/10. Because I don't have to do anything to that one since I've already got tenths as my denominator. Okay? Now I've got like fractions, I can add them. 2/10 plus 3/10 is 5/10. Now I can add my whole numbers. 5 plus 2 is 7. And remember, our last step, anytime we're dealing with fractions, is always to simplify as necessary. I know that on 5/10, both of those have a common factor of 5 that I can divide out. So I'm going to divide both the numerator and the denominator by 5. And so that gives me my answer in simplest form is 7 1/2. Okay? And remember, if this is too fast for you, remember on YouTube you can hit that button to slow the video down, rewind if you need to, and then move on to our next example. So we've got 8 2/3 minus 2 1/2. Remember, we're adding or subtracting here the fractions first, but remember they have to have the same common denominator. 3 and 2, I know that my least common denominator would be 6, so I'm going to do what I need to do to get them to a same denominator of 6. 3, I know I can multiply by 2, and I'll do the same thing to the numerator there. And so that gives me 8 4/6. Then I've got 2 1/2 again. I'm trying to get to that denominator of 6, so I'm going to multiply that 2 by 3 to get to 6, and I'll do the same thing to the numerator. So that means that I'm subtracting 2 3/6. Okay. So now that I have the same denominator, I can start by adding or subtracting my fractions first. So 4/6 minus 3/6, 4 minus 3 is 1. And now I can subtract my whole numbers. 8 minus 2 is 6. And that is in simplest form. So my answer is 6 1/6. Okay? So just make sure that when you're trying these on your own, add or subtract the fractions first. And remember to do least common denominator if you need to. And then add or subtract your whole numbers. So I'll go ahead and put up some examples for you. I want you to pause the video and try these examples on. So let's check your answers. Your first one was 5 4/5 minus 1 3/10. Remember, the first thing we need to do is get that common denominator. And I know the LCD of 5 and 10 would be 10. So I multiplied 5 by 2 to get my denominator of 10. And I did the same thing to the numerator. So it's 5 8/10 minus 1 3/10. Remember, start on the right, subtract the fractions first. So 8 minus 3, 5/10. Whole numbers, 5 minus 1 is 4. And then don't forget to simplify. So I can divide both of those by by 5, their common factor, to get 4 1/2. Okay? On your second example, 1 5/9 plus 4 1/6. First thing, common denominator. And I did my multiples up here just in case you need a reminder of that. But I found that my LCD was 18. So 9 times 2 gives me 18. And do the same thing to the numerator. 6 times 3 gives me 18, and do the same thing to its numerator. So I end up with 1 10/18 plus 4 3/18. Start with the fractions. 10 plus 3 is 13/18. Whole numbers, 1 plus 4 is 5. So our answer is 5 13/18, and that's in simplest form. All right, Let's go on to the next concept. So sometimes when you subtract mixed numbers, the first mixed number, the fraction in that first mixed number is less than the fraction in the second mixed number. Okay? And so when this happens, we have to rename the first fraction as an improper fraction, or borrow, in order to subtract. So just like you borrow when you're doing subtraction with whole numbers, like you have to borrow from one and add 10 to the other, the same thing happens when you're dealing with fractions. So let's make sure that we continue with what we had been doing, where we start by adding or subtracting the fractions and then move to the whole number. Okay? So here I need to do 1/3 minus 2/3. Well, if you think about it, 1, we can't take away 2 without going negative. Okay? So since we can't take away 2/3 from 1/3, this is where we have to borrow or rename that fraction as an improper fraction. Okay, so just to make this a little bit easier to understand, I'm going to draw a model of that. Okay, so we have 2 wholes and 1/3. So here's 1 whole, 2 wholes, and then this one I'm going to split into 3 pieces, but we only have 1/3 of that. So here's 2 and 1/3. I need to take away 1 and 2/3. Well, I only have 1/3 here, okay? And so some way we need to borrow or rename as an improper fraction in order to be able to take away that 2/3, okay? Well, the way I can do that is borrowing from this 1 whole. So what borrowing looks like is changing this from 1 to thirds, because we're trying to take away thirds. And so 1 whole would end up being 3/3, because I would split it into 3 pieces. So 1, 2, 3 thirds. Okay? So I still have 2 and 1/3, but it's just divided up a different way. So now, if I were to rename this as an improper fraction, I would say that I have 1 whole, okay? And instead of just 1/3, I have 1, 2, 3 from the one that I borrowed or I changed, okay? 4. So that's 1 whole and then 4/3. Now, I can take away 1 and 2/3, okay? Because 4/3 minus 2/3 leaves me with just 2/3. And of course, that's in simplest form. We can also look at that with the model. So I'm taking away 1 whole, okay? So this 1 whole is gone, and I'm taking away 2/3. So here's 1/3, 2/3, and so all that's left is 2/3. Okay, so I know that that can be a little bit tricky, so we're going to do some more examples with the borrowing or renaming as an improper fraction. Okay, so our next example, we've got 4 and 1/6 minus 2 and 1/3. First thing that we need to do is get our common denominators, LCD. Okay, so I know the least common denominator between 6 and 3 would be 6, and I just have to multiply this by 2, and I have to do the same thing to the numerator. Okay, and so that means I have 2 and 2/6 that I need to take away from 4 and 1/6. So we run into this problem again. I cannot take 2/6 away from 1/6. Okay, and so since we're still developing this concept, let's look at the borrowing. Okay, so I'm going to draw the picture of it where I have 4 wholes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1/6. So that means this one has to be split into 6 pieces. Okay, and I only have 1 of them. Okay, and so what I need to do, I need to give away or take away 2/6, but there's only 1 here. So what I'm going to do is borrow. Okay, so this one I'm going to change that 1 whole into 6, because I want to keep that same denominator. And I know that that would be 6/6 to keep this 1 whole, and so I'm just going to divide it up into 6 pieces. Okay, so if we look at this now and we wanted to rename it as an improper fraction, I now have 1, 2, 3 wholes, okay, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 little pieces, or 7/6. Okay, so I borrowed the 1 whole here, changing it into 6/6. Add that to the 1/6 I already have, so 6/6 plus the 1/6 gives me the 7/6. And because I borrowed one of these wholes, I only have 3 wholes left now. Now I can do my subtraction. So subtract the fractions first. 7 6 minus 2 6. Well, 7 minus 2 is 5. And then 3 minus 2 is 1. Okay? And we can look at that with our model as well. If we're taking away 2 wholes and 2 6, okay, that leaves me with this 1 whole, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? Hopefully you're getting the hang of it. Let's look at another example. So now we've got 5 minus 3 3/4. Now someone might make the mistake of just bringing that 3/4 down, but we can't do that. We've got to think about this as 5 wholes, and then there's no fraction here. Okay, so 0/4. So I can't take 3/4 away from 0/4, so that requires me to do my borrow, or renaming it as an improper fraction. And again, just while we're developing this concept, if you need it, I'm going to draw the model. If you don't need it, feel free to fast forward. Okay, so I've got 5 wholes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We need to take away 3 wholes and 3/4, but I don't have any fourths to take away. So the way I get those fourths is borrowing or changing one of my wholes to fourths, which would be 4/4. Okay, so I'm just going to divide it up into fourths. Okay, now we can rename as the improper fraction because we've got 4 wholes and then 4/4. So 5 becomes, because we're borrowing, 4 and 4/4. Okay? Now I can take away 3 and 3/4. Subtract my fractions. 4/4 minus 3/4 is 1/4. 4 minus 3 is 1. Okay? And let's check it just by going with the model, okay? So let's take away 3 wholes. 1, 2, 3, and then 3/4. So 1, 2, 3. And so if I look at my picture, I got one little piece there and 1 whole. So that's 1 and 1/4. All right? So hopefully you're following along. If you need to, remember, go back, rewind, rework them if you need to. If you're feeling good and confident about that, I want you to try these next 2 examples on your own. So go ahead and pause the video while you do that. Let's check your answers. So here we had 3 1/4 minus 1 3/4. And I just drew the model here just in case you need it. But we can't take away 3/4 from 1/4, okay? And so what we do is we borrow or rewrite as an improper fraction. So what I would do is change this 1 whole to fourths. So 4/4. And we can divide that up that way, okay? And so that's how we now get 2 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fourths. Okay, now we can do our subtraction. So 5 minus the 3/4. Okay, so I'm taking away 3 of the fourths, gives me just 2/4 left over, and then 2 minus 1 gives me 1 whole left over. So now I've got 1 and 2/4, and we know we can simplify that to 1 and 1/2. Okay. The next example you were supposed to do is 5 minus 1 and 1/3. Remember, you can't just bring that 1/3 down because this is like you have no thirds. And you cannot take away 1/3 from no thirds. And so we have to do our borrow. Okay, so if I had 5 wholes, okay, I would change one of these wholes or borrow from it, change that 1 to the same denominator here, so thirds, so 3/3. So I can just split it into 3 pieces. Okay, so now renaming my fraction is a little bit easier, doing an improper fraction, because I can see that there are 4 wholes and 3/3. Okay, now we can do our subtraction. We need to take away 1 whole and take away 1/3. So now there's 2/3 left there, 3 wholes, 3, and 2/3. Okay, I know this one's a lot. Okay, so if you have questions, first, try going back through the video. Remember, you can slow it down on YouTube, rewind, pause, rework problems if you need to. Once you're done with that, make sure that you do your reflection, okay? And so for your reflection today, I want you to answer the following questions. How is using improper fractions or borrowing similar to borrowing when subtracting whole numbers?